Hi everyone, this is Casey. I wanted to share a quick reminder that enrollment is now open for the next cohort of my signature Paradigm Shift program. This is the program where I personally coach you through taking action with the essential skills and mindsets you need to support your PDA child or teen and make true progress. After every cohort, I ask parents for feedback, and what they say over and over again is that the program is life-changing. It empowered them to transform their relationship with their child and stabilize their home. You can use the link in the show notes to learn more, join the program interest list, or dive right in and enroll for immediate access. Now, on to today's show. Hi, and welcome to the At Peace Parents podcast. I'm Casey, and I'm here to empower you in your decision making as a parent of a demand avoidant child. My goal is to share insights that will generate aha moments and support your connection with your child. I'm a mom of two amazing little boys, one of whom is PDA, and I've worked with hundreds of parents just like you to teach them how to lead their child out of burnout and find the clarity, peace, and sense of community they need. Welcome everyone to the At Peace Parents podcast. Today I'm with one of my favorites, Dr. Alex Klein, who is a clinical psychologist and dad himself. He works with families that have neurodivergent children, but primarily PDA children. Today we're going to have a fun topic because a couple weeks ago, Alex shot me an email that was pet peeves in the PDA space from a professional perspective. And it really piqued my interest and got us thinking about some of these harmful myths that circulate among professionals and clinicians regarding PDA, its existence, what it means, and that impacts parents and families and their children. So I'm going to kick it off by asking Alex to tell us what was behind that email that he sent. Is there a story there?
Yeah, I think it's not even just one particular story. It's that the things I hear, sometimes it's on social media. Sometimes this is, hearing somebody on a podcast that's maybe not related to PDA, but maybe mentioned something in PDA. I'm not sure. But it's these sort of harmful messages that I think are reflect stereotypes about PDA and that serve to not help parents understand, kids understand what PDA is. And I think that the thing that I was probably struck by in the moment that I sent you that email about, these myths I see as harmful was this idea that when talking about PDA, when parents are bringing up PDA, it's this idea that they're talking about, that you hear from some people saying like, oh, well, all kids have demand avoidance. This is just sort of like typical kid behavior, right? Like, of course, sometimes my kid doesn't want to brush their teeth. And like, so am I going to call that PDA? Right. And so this is really irritates me to say the least, because as you know, as we know, this is very, very different than that. I think that was the thing that I was referring to when we first brought that up.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I'm in my thinking brain and in safe and social and not as a mom super pissed that someone has said all kids do that, one of the ways that I've explained it to like well-meaning people who have said like,
Sure.
yeah, like, well, my kid equalizes or my kid doesn't eat and they're picky or my kid avoids this. One of the ways I explain it is like, yeah, this is human behavior, but what happens when we correct it or we try and support it activates their nervous system as if it's a trauma response. And so two kids might both be like, I don't want to brush my teeth. But the non-PDA kids' parents going to be like, hey, bud, gotta brush the teeth. And they're going to be like, okay. Or like, oh, I don't want to, but then they do it. But the PDA child, even if they comply, there will be a nervous system activation, even if it's internalized. And that builds in the system to the point where they're being disabled.
Right. That's the huge cost of
That's
it.
the difference that
Right.
in when I'm being charitable or like when
Right.
I'm viewing people charitably and really trying to understand. But I
Yeah.
think we have these blanket statements by not well meaning practitioners who are just completely discounting this as, well, all kids avoid things or all kids have.
Right.
And I think
Right.
I'd love to just hear like why that rankled you. Like tell me from a professional perspective, like how that felt and what your
Yeah.
argument would be.
Yeah. Because I'd say of the hundreds of families that have come to me suspecting PDA in their child, I can't think of a single example where we were just talking about like typical stuff. Like we're talking about very serious issues, like not able to go to school for long periods of time, stopping eating for a period of time, the need for control and how extreme the demand avoidance gets is sort of far beyond what we might see in sort of typical child development. So again, it's a sort of like a stereotype, I guess. Like, yeah, sure, there is forms of demand avoidance in all people for sure, right? It's not that. It's more that like in the PD space, we're talking about something much more extreme. So it's sort of taking what is common in kids and saying, oh, well, that's what's PDA, right? When really we have something that's far more disabling. And I think that message serves to kind of invalidate parents or make them feel like, oh, like, somebody thinks this is just normal stuff. And I think parents know in their heart that it's not. This is not
Yeah.
just typical child behavior. But if it's being communicated in some way that it is by another provider, that the provider is really missing something, and the parent is left feeling unseen, unsupported, not understood, then the kids are not ultimately encouraged to get the kind of supports that they need. So I just see this kind of thing as like really, really harmful and really, really pervasive, this one.
So why is that? Because when I think about it, and I'm like, so many of the families I've worked with, they're being told to, okay, hospitalize your child or put in a feeding tube, or, I mean, these are extreme cases, but like, you need to learn how to restrain them. Like, I was told to restrain my child by his public school district.
Mm,
And, you need to go into this behavioral program. We won't consider anti-anxiety medication until you put your kid through this behavioral program for OCD, whatever it is. And all of those approaches to me are much more risky than
yeah.
what some of the things we're suggesting are for PDA, which is like signal nervous system safety to them. Don't push them through a trauma response if they can't do the thing. Lower
Mm,
the demand or accommodate and provide more
mm,
autonomy. And it's like, why is it that, like, quote, these evidence based but often harmful approaches are so easily bought into? And like, why
yeah.
is it that, like, what we're saying is give kids some more autonomy, signal some more safety, maybe take the pressure off, and, be a little less authoritarian and like give them more one on one attention. And it's like you're doing the wrong thing. Like,
Mhm.
I don't get it from like a logical perspective why there is such resistance to this idea that some kids may actually not need to be pushed through things or exposed to things or need to get
Right.
used to things. So where do you think that comes
Yeah. I
from,
mean, I
like
think that
your colleagues?
links.
From like
Yeah.
not your personal colleagues, but like your other clinicians, right?
Yeah. Well, I think it first comes from a lack of understanding, but I think it also links to this sort of other pervasive and harmful myths that, children need to be controlled, that, this behaviors that they're doing is, attention seeking behavior that, if we can sort of frame it that way, that sort of justifies either just ignoring the behaviors or, pushing through it. I think that to answer your question more directly, I mean, I think it probably has to do with sort of the influence of the concept of behaviorism in culture, right? So like Watson, I think John Watson was the name of like considered one the father of behaviorism in some way. He used to say that, moms damage their kids by being too loving and coddly, right? And this was probably before the message that, oh, but if you're too cold, then you're a refrigerator mother who's causing your child's autism, right? So it's either you're too warm or you're too cold. So there's some real kind of like parent
Misogyny.
blame and misogyny, yes, that like absolutely intersects with all of this. So those are some of the things that are coming to mind in this. I think that, this sort of like very kind of capitalism driven, like that we must kind of push through, like lowering demands is a very sort of counter cultural concept, right? Of sort of like it's not, we're much more focused on like achievement maybe and efficiency, right? And, this idea that children must be controlled and we must be the boss of them, right? And so for a clinician to say to a parent who's really struggling, okay, well, I think we need to lower the demands, that sort of takes some of these other common concepts and throws them out the window and really is like looking at a child in a different way and looking at the family in a different way.
Yeah. But what's interesting is like, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but like if I sat down to coffee with one of these very intelligent clinical psychologists and talked about like, do you think it's a good idea to homogenize how we treat children and push them beyond their threshold into a trauma response in the name of like making cookie cutter and efficient kids that can plug into corporations? They would be like, no.
Right. Right.
Like I
Right.
honestly think that, like if you laid it out like that, but it's so pervasive in the way that we think. And like I have it too, where it's like, I need to be productive. I need to be doing all the time. What if my kid doesn't go to college? Do they still have value? What's their contribution?
Mm-hmm.
What if they're not independent?
Mm-hmm. That same clinician, though, in this hypothetical scenario that's saying, oh, well, no, of course you don't want to push your child into, and overwhelm them. I think that they might not see that. So this is where the sort of concept of hidden disability, I think, is important because, when somebody's having a seizure or something, an extended seizure, when you were trying to push them to like, nope, keep getting your shoes on, like that would be seen as like, of course, highly inappropriate and ridiculous because we have a more clear-cut way of understanding what the resistance is about, right? And so when it comes to sort of forms of neurodivergence and something like PDA, it's much less visible. So it's much more, it's sort of more easy to kind of interpret this as like, oh, this kid's just trying to be defiant or something. So I think that again, it sort of gets into like a misunderstanding of root cause, like you talk about a lot, Casey, like the root causes of challenging behaviors. I think if we misunderstand the root cause of challenging behaviors and we apply a different framing to it, like, again, this is just sort of attention seeking, that sort of implies that these behaviors are under a kid's control. And if we have that framing, that is going to justify, again, approaching it in a way that is going to be very inappropriate for some kids. So I think that's part of it too.
Yeah. So let's talk about this attention seeking because that's something I heard a lot.
Mm-hmm.
My son was young and I sort of ascribed to it as well. I didn't ignore him, but I would certainly hear other people say it about him. Like when I was, trying to do a play date and I couldn't speak to the other mom because he was constantly needing my one-on-one attention, or I'd be trying to have his grandparents, like a Zoom call or a FaceTime. And, he'd be interested in saying hi for 1 minute. And then I would try and have a conversation and he would be escalating and climbing all over me and like impulsively interrupting me. And this need for signals of safety, I now understand it as like, oh,
right,
he's scared, like he's perceiving threat and he's seeking safety through my undivided attention as a safe nervous system. But it's so easy to see that as attention seeking, which has a negative connotation. And then what you're told to do is like, well, don't reinforce that behavior because then it'll get worse.
Mm.
But that implies that, again, whatever the behavior is under their conscious control and motivated. And like, if we look at it through a nervous system lens, which is happening in neuroception, which is not even conscious,
Mm-hmm.
and see like they don't actually have control over these nervous system responses.
Right.
Then we can look at it at a total as a totally different way. But like
Right.
if you're not viewing it like that, parents are just told like, well, don't respond to it because then they'll keep doing it. But if they ignore the kid, that's when their nervous system escalates and it's like the kid starts destroying the siblings' things, or they start taking apart the printer, or they run
Yeah.
out the front door. And it's just
Right.
like more and more threat.
Right, right. Or in sort of sad scenarios that I see sometimes is where a kid stops trying to get their needs met, right? Because it's like it's just been getting ignored. It's not being seen. And you pointed out, right, where your child was seeking safety and comfort and was anxious and uncomfortable in the situation and needing a lot of sensory input, needing a lot of, mommy snuggles and needing a lot of this and that. And yeah, it can come off in a way that's like quote unquote inappropriate and difficult. But again, yeah, I think you're right. If we frame it in that's like, oh, this is just attention seeking, then we sort of, right, we're not seeing what are some of the underlying needs that the child has. And then again, if we are seeing some of the underlying needs that the child has, like maybe, so then we're not just ignoring it. We're trying to support the child, trying to slowly, engage them by you going over to do the other activity. If the kid can't do the other activity, maybe you're slowly connecting the kid to one other person because trying to connect to the whole group is going to be too much for them, right? I mean, that's just an example, but there's other ways to kind of go about trying to manage what's going on, but the child's only kind of needing something from you and you're in this group setting rather than just ignoring it, which I think is largely not going to work with many kids.
Yeah, with the PDA kids, certainly not.
Yeah.
I mean, it's annoying, right? Like, I have a hard time with like every thought in my brain being interrupted by
Right.
help or attention,
Of
right?
course.
Certainly
Yeah.
calmed down a lot since my son's burnout and when he was younger.
Sure. Oh, yeah. It's hugely hard for you. Of course. Yeah.
But, and I get it. I get it. Like, as a parent, how frustrating it can feel.
Right. Right.
But, the more I tried to approach it as if it were under his conscious control, the more things escalated and it undermined our connection.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. No, it's a huge one. It's a huge one.
Yeah. So can I ask you this? Like when you were doing
Yeah.
PhD, this is where I don't have the canon or the literature background or clinical experience that you do. Like, did you learn about attention seeking as like a theory? Or like, is it part of like, look out for this, clinicians? Like,
Mhm.
or
I
where
don't,
did
yeah,
it come
that's a good
from?
question. Yeah, I don't think I had like remember a moment where I was like, I would say I do remember reading about behaviorism and the logic of behaviorism, but I think that most of these thoughts I have is probably kind of coming out of years of sort of like, so for example, recently, many people know what an FBA is at school, like a functional behavioral assessment, where, maybe they're looking at like antecedents of behavior. And I was looking at one, and it was probably like the 50th one that I've seen where it was like attention seeking is is why this kid is throwing a pencil or running out of the room or refusing to do work or something like that. When, in my mind, it's pretty clear that there's some other root cause issues going on that's leading to the behaviors they're seeing. So I think just time and time again, I've been seeing this in the real world. And again, also seeing how with a subset of the kids, how that framing has been really harmful and does not work to just sort of ignore the behavior, do these other things.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost like, some schools are great. I'm on my mind. I'm just gonna like tell a
Hmm.
little bit of a personal story. Like, I went for a walk with a mom who I'm close to in my neighborhood this morning to talk about the public school that's 3 blocks away from our home where our son could not access. And we had an extraordinarily terrible experience with them essentially pushing us out intentionally. And the same thing is happening to her. And when you say attention seeking, it takes the responsibility off of the teacher or the administrator or the school to actually address something like they're having a sensory experience that's making them want to flee the classroom, or they're perceiving threat around, having to walk from the front door by themselves as a kindergartner all the way into the classroom. And
Hmm.
if we say it's attention seeking, then we don't have to change our rules about like the mom can't walk the kid to the classroom, right? And if
Right.
it's something else, like, this kid is perceiving danger and actually needs another safe mammal to just walk him into the classroom, it's like
Mm,
all of a sudden the administrator doesn't have that like rule or control, which
right.
I find so flabbergasting when we're thinking about like,
Right.
how can kindergartners like learn, like
Right.
this
Right.
isn't like a military barrack. Like, why are
Right.
we doing it this way?
Yeah. No, that's a good point, right? It's sort of like, when the administrators are sort of stuck in that, it's again the sort of notion of control. And I talk about this a lot. It's like, we talk about in a PDA population or an autistic population, we may talk about the concept of flexibility or lack thereof, difficulty being flexible. But like what I see is like when kids are having trouble being flexible, maybe, I don't know, oh, there's a new teacher, or having a hard time at the start of the school year, adjusting to a new routine or something. It's like meeting that difficulty being flexible with the administrator also not being flexible is not going to work. And oftentimes, and theoretically, the adults, the administrators, and teachers have more ability to be flexible, yet are choosing not to do it. Whereas the kid, they're not trying to be inflexible; like they are struggling to
Yeah.
meet the expectations. That's what's happening there. But we meet that struggle with sort of equal parts inflexibility. Like that is a bad recipe here.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's so interesting what you said about the functional behavioral
Yeah.
assessment,
FBA, functional behavioral assessments, or BIPs, BIPs. I don't know, all this
where
kind of
it's like
stuff. Yeah.
that is the antecedent, right? And
Yeah. Often I see that one. Yeah.
but like if I don't know, from a social scientist perspective, like I'm like, what's the observable indicator that lets you know that that's what's going on, right? Like, what proof do you have? You're just ascribing a meaning, and if you don't either observe patterns with your own two eyes objectively or get information from the child themselves, like you're just making it up.
Right. And I think and that gets into this difference between like observable behaviors versus internal experience. And it's true that we do want to look at internal experience. Like, for example, the kid didn't get to choose to write a sentence about, Pokemon. They had to write a sentence that did not involve Pokemon. And so, therefore they were more, then they acted out or something like that. Right. So the internal reason might be that like a lack of control and threat response, right? So there's still like an internal experience that we're hypothesizing or that we are considering. But again, if we are sort of going with the attention seeking one, it kind of leads to something that is ultimately not helpful for some of these kids.
Yeah. Well, sometimes they can tell us, I want to write about Pokemon,
Right. Mhm.
like if we actually listen.
Right. 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 Exactly.
Um,
Exactly. Yeah.
we're a little like fiery today
I
because
know. I think we are. I think
we're
we
like
are. Lots
mad.
going on.
No,
Yeah.
I'm just kidding. These are harmful myths. They're harmful, and that's why we get passionate. Okay.
Yeah. It just ties in with this concept of like behavior as intentional too. I mean, I guess in theory, a behaviorist could say it's attention seeking that's not purposeful, but I think it really implies intentionality when we say attention seeking. And I think oftentimes these are kids that are struggling and we need to see it that way. That's, and that there's other things leading to the challenging behaviors. And that's what we got to focus on. Of course, kids do things that seek, to seek connection with us and to get, time with us. But again, like attention seeking has like, you don't really ever hear that in like a positive context, do you? It implies something negative.
Yeah.
There's
Well,
something
it's
wrong
also,
with this person.
yeah, from like a deeper perspective, it's like it has a negative connotation, but why is that bad? Like, why is it
Right.
bad to seek human connection if you're having a hard time? Or
Yeah,
other
good point.
I don't know. I mean, here's the thing. There's no black and white. Like, obviously, some kids, I'm sure, and some people seek attention, right? Like,
Sure.
I'm on
Right.
social media, I see it happen. And there are times
Right.
when I'm like, oh, I need to get attention in my not finest moments to reach enough people on my social media, right? So people do it. But
Hmm.
underlying anytime I've created content for attention is fear of like, what
Right.
if my business isn't going to go well? Or
Right.
what if I can't serve parents? It's not because I
Hmm.
just like want attention all the time. You know?
Totally. I believe you. Yes, of course. Right.
Anyways, that's a little
Right.
bit of a tangent, but my personal experience to validate that, like, yes, some people do seek attention.
Yes. Yes. Right. Right. But it's like what's behind that is the key here. Yeah.
Okay, so interwoven with all of this, we have this theme, which I think is a harmful myth that has a long history in the autism space, which you mentioned with Watson, which
Mm,
is the parental blame element, which seems to have been directed historically and continues to be at women.
yeah.
Not
If
always, but like,
Oh yeah. If only you were more consistently giving consequences, then everything would be fine. Didn't you know that, Casey? Didn't
yeah.
you know that that's all we had to do to make this problem go away? I mean, what a harmful myth, right? Because if it was as simple as giving consequences, like I don't think I would have anybody reaching out to me in my practice. Like
Me
if it was that easy, right? If it was that easy, just like the threat of a consequence, have all the challenging behaviors going away. And I would argue that we want to try to avoid that in general, not just the PDA. But I think what is critical is how with the PDAers, right? Like this is really not going to work, and often is going to worsen the situation. Yet, right? Yet we are hearing that constantly, right? Like if only you were more consistent, if only you did better concepts, if only he had more boundaries at home. If only you're putting more limits on her, then and it's that could be conveyed in subtle ways. In some ways, sometimes it's very direct. And have you felt, Casey, or your clients felt when they hear stuff like that? Like,
Oh my
what's
God,
your
it's
sense
the
of
worst. I mean, it's the
right?
absolute worst. So I've experienced it as a mom
Yeah,
for years, right?
yeah.
With pediatricians and therapists. And, I remember going to a child psychologist in Washington, D.C. And I was more worried about, like, I just felt like something was different about my son, this one on one undivided attention need of like, he needed me constantly when he wasn't in his,
Yeah.
I was trying to do the Montessori stuff of like putting the pitcher down lower when he's 2.5 so he can start to like be independent. And he just wasn't engaging. And I would sort of have to like entertain him improv because there was no reciprocity or like engagement or initiative in his play.
Yeah.
And, she fixated on the fact that he had a pacifier and
Mm,
started talking about how I was enabling him and it was gonna lead to him being one of those like dependent and spoiled and entitled men.
mm,
I was like,
wow.
he's
Yeah.
three. He's three
Waste
years old,
three.
man. And
Oh
I'm
my
trying to talk
God.
to you about like, and she's like, you
Mm,
have to be consistent. You have to take this away, And then when he started to escalate and have behavioral problems and also eating problems, we were
mm,
approaching it. I mean, I traumatized my son because of how consistent I was with timeouts and discipline. Like,
right.
I was extraordinarily consistent. I had Excel spreadsheets. And like, eventually, I hit a breaking point, and I think I'm lucky in the sense that like I was confident enough to know my own capacity, and I knew that I was being
Mm,
consistent, so I could actually eventually override that doubt. But I
mm,
think part of that is because of my life experience and working at a high level in a competitive organization, of getting a PhD and 2 master's degrees. Like, I had confidence in myself of like, I'm not a turkey, but like no, you don't need any of that to not be a turkey. I just think it like gave me more confidence and my husband supported me. But
Yeah.
like if you're a parent who like doesn't have a spouse who's supporting you and also casting doubt, or like if you have some self-doubt around, I don't know, your own consistency or discipline anyways, maybe because you're ADHD or because maybe that's something your parents told me, there's that added layer of like, well, maybe that's true. Maybe I'm not consistent. Maybe I'm not disciplined. Maybe it is my fault. And
Right.
parents doubt themselves so much, even though they
Right.
know that they've been consistent on a certain level.
Yeah, it's like the messages from providers are like sort of, contrary to their own parental instincts. And of course, it's going to feel invalidating and feel horrible and feel hopeless and helpless when that's the message you're getting. When you've tried that and it has not worked. I mean, that is the story I hear time and time again,
Yeah.
all the time.
So, like, from a clinical standpoint, like, if I'm being, again, charitable and trying to put myself in the position of the other person, I'm always thinking, like, benefit of the doubt. Like, they're trying to help, right? They're trying to help this family. So, what is it about this, like, is it all going to go back to behaviorism? Like, why is it like, why can't it be like, hey, I believe you. Like, it seems like you've experimented with this paradigm or approach. It hasn't worked. You've collected some data. Let's develop another hypothesis and try something different consistently and see if that changes things along these dimensions. Like, why there is this doubling down on, like, well, you must be doing something wrong as a parent versus a more scientific approach.
Yeah, I mean, that is a good question that, I mean, I don't know, besides stuff I already said around sort of, the sort of enduring, behaviorism concepts and various theories that blame moms for the problems that, occur in kids. I mean, I think all of that plays in here. And I'm sure there's other elements too. I think when, again, right, there's limitations in our training. Like, so for example, it wasn't, I'd already graduated, already got my doctorate and become a licensed psychologist by the time I came across the psychologist Ross Greene, who talks about in the book, The Explosive Child, like more collaborative problem solving. And this is an approach I try to use in my work with families and collaborating to try and problem solve when these issues are happening, because that's another myth that in the PDA parenting space that we recommend no boundaries ever and no limits ever and just let a kid, hurt, like obviously that's inaccurate,
Another
but,
good myth.
like,
That's
right.
another
Another good myth. Yes. But
thing.
I think, right. But I think that clinicians and pediatricians, et cetera, like we just might not know. Might not have been really exposed to other ways. And then this is sort of like our sort of, reflexive, like, oh, I don't know if I know how to be helpful here. I'm just going to default to behaviorism. I think that's often what happens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you learned about Watson, so it sounds like I'm going to name what I heard you say. So like there's this, and maybe the chronology is wrong. First, it's like, don't be too loving, right? Because then they're coddled and enabled and spoiled. And what time period was that? Like,
That's a good question. I want to say early 1900s, but
okay. And then we get the refrigerator stuff, which, what, like 30s, 40s? Refrigerator
50s,
mom?
60s, 70s. I mean,
Oh,
like
okay.
not as long ago as we might think. I should double check all this before I say it on a podcast.
Yeah, we should have reread Neurotribes for this.
We should have, I know. Yeah.
Well, regardless of the dates, the chronology. First we have the like, don't be too loving, then we have don't be too cold. And then now I feel like it's like a third wave of like, don't be too flexible.
Right.
Don't be like too attuned, you know? But like when you were studying and learning and processing sort of your discipline, was it presented to you as like this is a school of thought, or was it like this is the way we do things as psychologists? And how did you react to that as a student?
Yeah, I mean, good question. I think to be fair, it was presented to me as schools of thought for the most part, except that the main school of thought in the sort of child. I mean, I took classes and on sort of adult psychotherapy methods, and it was like really broad generalist training. But yeah, when I did take child, I think it was just more that it was emphasized, so more of the behaviorism. But in my case, I had come to my path was actually sort of ABA way before grad school, as a young 20 something many years ago, and getting disillusioned and sort of disturbed by some of the stuff I was seeing. And then I got really into a DIR floor time world, which I know that you're aware of, Casey. And so I was already had been sort of digging into that world. I'd already been really interested in sort of the different types of philosophy. So before even getting training. But yeah, I mean, I think that's more unusual, right? Like, the dominant paradigm, right? In, ABA, behaviorism, this is way more mainstream than some of this other stuff that we're talking about.
Yeah. I think what's important for parents to hear, and that I understood intuitively because I did a doctorate, and it's like, okay, I learned through the lens of political science, but I had friends who were economists or sociologists or anthropologists, and each school of thought and epistemology, like how do we know what's true and how do we see the world, was distinct, but it didn't mean any one of us was the truth. It was just lenses, right? Disciplines.
Yeah. Yes.
So the point here is like what your therapist or psychologist or some are going to be trained in is one school of thought, which is not like a concrete truth. You know what I mean? Like it's one way of viewing things, and maybe that's all they've been trained in, but it doesn't mean like that's the quote right way and only way. And it may be right for some, but like it is one way of viewing things, right? As you said, like behaviorism, but then you went the direction, or ABA, and then you went the direction of DIR floor time, which is a different lens, right?
Right.
And so one might be more dominant, but it doesn't mean one is like an absolute truth.
Right. Totally. And I think I've said this before, where I'm very curious to see how in, 30, 40 years, if I'm still around, what like how we'll be looking at all of this, right? We do have to kind of keep that historical perspective. And, all we can do is the best that we can with the knowledge that we have in the moment. But yeah, I do see a lot of some of these sort of mainstream practices as kind of missing the mark and really not incorporating, some of the current neuroscience, honestly, too, right? About how kids' brains work, well, the concept of intentionality and control of behavior and all this kind of stuff. I think that some of the sort of, early 20th century behaviorism stuff was missing, was missing some of the current knowledge we have. Yeah.
And my hope is like, I don't want to swing into another dogma of like every kid, we can never use any behaviorism and now it's all has to be about autonomy and lower demands, but rather seeing the child right in front of you and thinking about like what actually works for this kid, this family, and not gaslighting and judging others if it's different from, what a bunch of more mainstream people are doing,
Right. It's like blaming and judging, like placing blame with an individual, like individual parent, individual child, right? Rather than sort of like, this sort of broader view of how we want to treat people and understand behavior and stuff. Yeah. Really important.
So I know you have to go, but it was super fun to talk to you again. Thank you.
As always, you're welcome. Great to chat, Casey.
Great to chat with you too. Thanks everyone for being here with me at the At Peace Parents podcast. This is your source for all things related to understanding, supporting, accommodating, and advocating for your PDA child. To go deeper on any of these topics, check out my course offerings and masterclasses at the website www.atpeaceparents.com. To completely transform the way you think about and relate to your child and to bring peace and stability to your home, join us for the next cohort of the Paradigm Shift program.